Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Carol Gould, who is Professor of Philosophy at Florida Atlantic University, where she teaches primarily aesthetics, philosophy of psychiatry, and ancient Greek philosophy, areas in which she publishes widely. Many of her recent publications concern the relation between aesthetics, ethics, and personhood. She's currently completing a book on True Glamour, an unexplored topic in philosophy that stands at the intersection of aesthetics, ethics, and philosophy of psychiatry. Welcome, Carol.
Hi, Gil.
You were working on a book when we were talking about this a few months ago. I think you're still working on the title as well. It was a book on glamour. Maybe it is something like glamour, authenticity, interiority, and personhood, or something along those lines. But you mentioned in your note, in your email, that you have been refining and perhaps changing some of your thoughts. And so I want to pick up on that. We talked a bit about glamour. We had a bit of a debate around, can we even get a computer to identify glamour in a human being? That is still up for debate. But how are your thoughts perhaps changed a bit in the book?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because your question actually prompted me to develop it in certain ways, because I was thinking about how much AI can do now, we see. And I was at a talk a couple of months ago, on Zoom, of course, and the speaker was showing artworks, and they were really quite impressive, and they turned out that they had been created by machines. And right. I thought, okay, so the idea here was that the machine could recognize standards of beauty and or artistic conventions, because in some cases, I wouldn't call them beautiful, but they were interesting and artistic. Not groundbreaking artistic, but they were quite artful, let me say. And then I thought about all these things that machines are being able to do. And I have a friend here who works in AI, and it's just extraordinary what I've been learning. But you asked me, can a machine recognize glamour? And I must say I was baffled by that. And at first I thought, my inclination now is to say no, and I'll explain why.
Yeah.
And that led me to ask another question. Can something artificially intelligent be glamorous?
Right.
Because they're talking about machines being able to make ethical judgments. I take it fairly simple ones. But, machine can certainly be programmed to understand whatever they do. Rules, which ethical rules or laws, etc. But then we get to the aesthetic, and you and I had talked about that briefly in our email. And I thought to myself, well, can a machine be glamorous? And there was a film in 2013. It was called Her. I don't know if you saw it.
Oh, yeah. I haven't seen it. I have heard about it, yeah.
Okay, it was with Joaquin Phoenix, who's always a very convincing actor. And he falls in love with an AI assistant, of some kind. And that made me wonder, well, can that AI-generated entity be glamorous?
Right.
And I have determined, at least I think I've concluded, not. And I know to both questions. Can a machine recognize glamour, and can a machine be glamorous? And I'm inclined to say no in both cases.
Yeah, so here is going to be the deficiency of machines. So going back to your art creating machine, I think what the machine will do is to create art that the average population would find interesting or attractive.
Attractive, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Right? Because it's sort of given a task, it will sort of optimize the output, right? So it has to design to the average person, given the heuristics it has. Now, what it will miss in that process is, as you say, it's interesting art, but not great art, right? So one could argue, machine could make interesting art, but it won't be able to push it to the tails of the distribution, right? Because it will feel meaningless to the machine to do that.
Yes, well, it'll feel meaningless, and you wouldn't expect it to be terribly expressive. But also, one of the things that makes art, I think, excellent, and what certainly makes it great, is that it kind of pushes the rules. It pushes the limits. It violates rules, and that's really what propels changes in art. I think in all of the arts, it's like with Debussy, his experimentation with harmony, and say some of the abstract early 20th century abstract painters who started experimenting with abstraction, and despite the fact that they were violating so many rules, like about picture space and color theory and so forth, and perspective. The piece was called a Fauvist because his way of painting was considered so wild, his use of color and so forth. And now, of course, it doesn't look at all extraordinary or revolutionary. And Picasso too, I mean, what they're doing is pushing the boundaries. What makes them extraordinary is that they're challenging them. That's part of the creativity. That's part of their imaginative process. So that's what I think a machine can't do. But of course, you know much more about that. And I take it that one of the things that machines do, that allows machines to do things that are sometimes referred to or described as better than humans, is the speed at which they do it. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So, humans are terrible in repeating tasks, in boring things. But I want to go to your question about glamour is really a much more complex question. So there are two questions you asked, right? One is, can machine recognize glamour? And the other is, can machine be glamorous? those questions are really abstract, complex questions. So I want to I want to pursue that with you.
Okay.
And so can we go back and sort of have a, it's very difficult to define, but do you have a sort of a short description of what you mean by glamour?
Well, yes, I do. Um, I'm how precise you'll find it, I don't know. But first of all, I make a distinction between true and false glamour. And I say that true glamour is, and I define it in more detail. I'll define it for you in more detail a little later if we have time. But true glamour is an unconscious or unintentional, mystery. And I think mainly it's a kind of power of coercion. It's an aura, and it's subtle, it's opaque, and importantly, it can't be reproduced. Because it emanates from the interior and one's subjectivity. And that's unique to an individual. I mean, each of us is different subjectively and in a variety of ways. Now, and in fact, I compare true glamour to what Walter Benjamin, who was a mid-20th century, early 20th century writer, called the aura of a work of art. He talks about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And that is, he says that the aesthetic experience can never be the same because you lose the aura of the work itself when you're looking at a print or something like that. So if you consider that, I mean, to me, glamour is like the aura of the artwork, the original artwork. And false glamour, I would say, is the use of material culture to suggest that one has a certain status, lifestyle, or position within the elite. I'd say that it's more common, especially today with social media. It's obvious, it's transparent, and also it requires effort. Okay, you have to keep up with the latest whatever shoes or styles, and be it in interiors or attire or makeup. And now with our masks, we have to worry. I guess that the trend is going towards eye makeup. That's so false glamour is, what we think of as Hollywood glamour, let's say. Okay. So that is, of course, reproducible. Now, I think that false glamour has stirred up a lot of mischief because of the ubiquity of images on social media and the rapid fire pace at which they are produced and can be communicated. So I would say that true glamour can enrich human experience, and false glamour, first of all, it can breed exhibitionism, especially today with TikTok and Instagram and so forth. And it breeds exhibitionism. I think it breeds false expectations that are usually disappointed by people, for people, and also conspicuous consumption. It's as if there wasn't enough of it. Now, I want to, though, make an important distinction here. I distinguish between character and personality. And I would say that true glamour is not an ethical quality. It's an aesthetic one. Because, we make value judgments of two sorts, ethical and aesthetic, and we make value judgments of those sorts about people. And so it's very easily confused. So I would attach glamour to the personality and character, and one's ethical nature to character. Although in philosophy, I should say, both these concepts, character and personality, are debated and how they should be analyzed and whether they're just myths and so forth, but philosophical myths, that is. So I would say that that's something we have to keep in mind. So it has to do with personality. And, there are various dimensions of human experience here. And I think one of them has to do with the role of imagination in everyday life. And I think that once we see that true glamour has to do with subjectivity, and thus with individuality, uniqueness, and also with personality, I think it's very hard to see how a computer could recognize that. But you know much more about AI than I do, so.
So what I will say, Carol, is I have a sort of a halfway answer to it, and that is, so you differentiate between true glamour and false glamour. Sorry, glamour. It appears to me that it is easier to recognize false glamour because it is driven by more stable heuristics. So if a human finds easier to identify false glamour, then we would be able to teach a machine to do that. Now, we won't be able to, agree with you, we won't be able to teach a machine to identify glamour. So if humans fit into three buckets, glamorous, true glamorous, sort of, not glamorous, and then false glamorous, that the third bucket is identifiable, very likely by a machine, but it won't be able to give you a positive answer, like you say, the personality is truly glamorous.
Yes, and I think that, well, you asked how I would define it, okay, and I would say, and I'll probably change my mind about this, or at least modify this to some extent. The glamour is the expression of an imaginative intensity. And I describe it as supervening on a projection of a range of imagined identities and possible experiences. And I think that I think it's a rare quality, and I think that we experience it or we recognize it less frequently than we perhaps once did because we're so overwhelmed with the images of false glamour. But I think that when it does catch someone's attention, it's a coercion. They're coerced. And that's how I see glamour. I mean, its effect on the observer, or the third person effect, would be one of coercion. And because there's an originality and an intensity, let's say, that somehow emanates, that one emits. And and I think that it emphasizes the human, the idea of individual and any human individual's uniqueness.
Right. It is sort of a two-way street, isn't it? A glamorous person won't be able to project himself or herself on the audience. Let me make a statement. You can correct me, Carol. Glamour emanates from sort of an interaction between the glamorous individual and the audience. If the audience is passive, then I would argue there may not be any glamour. Do you see it that way?
Well, actually, no. I think that it's true with false glamour. But with regard to true glamour, I mean, it's I still puzzle over this. But in this article I did many years ago, number of years ago, let's say, I drew on a distinction that I still love, and it's not mine. It's from the philosopher Arthur Danto, who's a major philosopher of our time, who died just recently. And he makes a distinction between manifesting itself, which he says is to live in the world as one finds it. It's a way of acting that implies, he says, no responsibility for creating the world. And then he talks about to express itself in contrast, which is to live in the world as it is, but, as he says, containing a fragment of reality from another world. So it has to do with, a person who's a hermit, doesn't really experience much, but it has to do with one's interior imagination and how and how that affects their being in the world. And I think that others are coerced by it, fascinated by it, and may be inclined to project their own fantasies onto that person. But I do think it's quite different. And I think that so glamour would be to express a self rather than manifest itself, a self rather. And I think if that's right, then it's not it's not so much a relational property. I think it's something one has. It's in oneself, and so. But you're right. I mean, there is a sense in which we're inclined to say, but if nobody sees that, doesn't it have something to do with that? And I would like to just go, if we can go back to, psychoanalysis and hysteria for a moment, which I mentioned when I talked about histrionic personality. If you think about a person who's, it's not a pleasant thing to think about, but imagine a person who's partially paralyzed, say. And it might be because of a physiological reason, or on the other hand, it could be a hysterical conversion. And the hysterical conversion, you know what I mean by that, some kind of trauma or perceived trauma that a person manifests bodily, which was, it still occurs, although people think it only occurred in the early 20th century, late 19th century, but it's always been around, hysterical conversion. But you see, I would say that the paralysis would be a manifestation or an expression, a manifestation of the self, because that's just the way things are. It's a physiological problem for whatever reason. Or there's a physiological etiology to it. To express the self, the hysteric is expressing a self.
Yeah.
Does that clarify it?
Yeah, I mean, so if I think about a thought experiment, if I put a true glamorous person in a world of no other people, would that person be glamorous?
Well, I was thinking about that because it's such an interesting question. I hadn't thought of it in quite those terms, but if the person, obviously a person, I think it's obvious, but a person who has had no exposure or interaction with others wouldn't have much of a language or sense of anything. They wouldn't really be in the world. I'm not sure people can develop a notion, anything like a self in that context. But suppose they had lived in the world, they were, they weren't raised, in a forest by animals, but, actually lived in a world, and then suddenly have found themselves isolated for whatever reason.
Right.
I do think that that person could still have a glamour if they have an active, because we deploy our imaginations in all sorts of ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that once that kind of experience, once one has the experience of the world and has lived in a world and developed a personality, then sure, I mean, I shouldn't say sure, but my hunch is to say yes. And I used the word develop a personality. I think that it would be not only strange, but almost abhorrent to call a child glamorous.
Yeah.
Because a child doesn't have a fully formed self. And certainly if they're falsely glamorous, that's terrible.
Yeah.
But so, but I think that's another great question that I need to address. You know, to what extent does it, if it isn't a relational property, to what extent does it depend upon there being others?
Yeah. It's ironically so. If it is an inherent property that the person is experiencing, it has no relationship to the environment and the people around that person, then I think, Carol, it will be difficult to teach a machine to recognize it. But ironically, I think if that were true, it will be possible to teach a machine to be glamorous. And I'll give, let me give you my justification
Okay.
for it. Um, so so if true glamour is an inherent property, so that makes the problem simpler in some ways because you don't have to worry about interactions. So I can take that person, put that person in any context, any environment, and I will always detect true glamour, right? Because it's inherently experienced by that person, regardless of the environment. Which makes the problem a lot simpler to model, in some ways. And so obviously, I'm just I'm just saying things here without knowing a lot about it. But mathematically, it feels like it's a problem that you could actually teach a machine to be glamorous because it can be reduced to perhaps set of heuristics. Whereas recognizing a person to be glamorous is more difficult because the inherent property, at least it sounds to me, is individualistic. In other words, I cannot generalize that property. If Tom is glamorous and Sally is also glamorous, they're glamorous in their own ways. It is not a generalizable property, if I understand it correctly.
Yes.
Do you see it that way?
Yes. Well, what I'm wondering, I mean, is whether a machine, whether it makes sense to talk about when, and again, you're the expert here, Gil, on AI, not on. So, I mean, would it even make sense to talk about a machine having a kind of a personality?
Yes.
What do you think? I mean, because the machine's history is not dynamic. It's not. I mean, I don't know how much it can change.
Yeah.
And of course, one's personality and one's imagination is going to be partly dependent on their intrinsic traits, but also on the way they've interacted with others in the world and the way they develop in certain ways. And then I think also that since every person, I think, has a unique take on the world, I think that's part of being a person, and some are more original than others. But more, some people have ironic takes on the world and, so forth and so on. But can a machine be endowed with that kind of subjectivity?
Yeah. So, it depends on if you believe this. So personality could be considered as an outcome of, as you say, interactions and history, environment, and all of that, right? All of that is data, ultimately. And so suppose we have, this is a thought experiment really, suppose we have all the data of an individual's interactions with her environment and humans that individual interacted with. That data can make a machine have an equivalent personality of that individual. The premise there obviously is the personality is driven by history and interactions.
So, yeah.
And I think that's a reasonable assumption, isn't it?
With regard to persons, you mean, or with,
yeah, with relation to persons. I mean, if when we look at somebody and we see that person's personality, that personality was developed by that person over that person's history, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And so but glamour to me is it's more complex construct, right? It's not just personality. It is how that person, it's not projection, but how that person experiences the personality in some ways, isn't it?
That's a really good way to put it. Yes, it's how they
Yeah.
experience their personality and how they
Yeah.
experience, how they experience the world, this, which is unique. I mean, for all of us.
Yeah.
Some less predictable than others, but and maybe more interesting. But I do, I think that that's a good point. That it's not just a personality, but it's also a reflection on the personality. So,
And what makes it complicated for a machine is that, as you say, it is unique to the individual. So it's not a generalizable um, characteristic.
yeah,
And so it's very difficult to teach a machine that is not, it's not a generalizable, non-generalizable thing, right? If so we look at Jim, and a large proportion of the crowd concludes Jim has true glamour, and we look at Sally, and a large proportion of the crowd believes Sally also has true glamour, but Jim's true glamour is not Sally's true glamour, right?
Yes.
So that's why machines will likely fail. I'm beginning to agree with you now.
You're beginning to agree with me? Okay, so yes, I mean, so that's that would be my answer to your question. That would be my justification for why I answered your question. No, I mean, because I gave it a lot of thought, and it actually led to my my refashioning of my argument in one of my central chapters. So, yeah.
Yeah. My no answer, Carol, is the way I'm thinking about it is that because it's unique to the individual, you cannot teach a machine to pick up true glamour from a crowd of 1,000 people. Let's say there are 10 glamorous people in that crowd, because the 10 people have their own unique version of glamour.
Yes. That's right. That's right.
right?
That's right.
So, yeah,
So, and because it's not like, say, beauty or something like that, and I'm actually not sure that that's so uniform, but I know that some people think that there is uniformity, there's some standards, criteria of beauty that are fixed, but I don't quite agree with that. But still, each person is beautiful differently. But of course, that's not. I don't think that's quite as complicated. But if if you have 10 beautiful people in a crowd, perhaps a machine could pick it up. But with regard to glamour, because it's so elusive, and
yeah,
because it really does emanate from within, from the subject, from one's unique subjectivity and imagination.
right.
That's yeah. So but that's it's such an interesting question. I mean, and whether a machine could have this property is another issue.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, does a machine, this is partly rhetorical, but also partly a real question, does a machine have subjectivity,
Yes.
subjective experience?
Experiences are generally subjective, and most of, so we are not there, obviously. We're just talking about how machines could evolve over time. I can see situations where you would have those types of machines having feelings, machines making decisions under uncertainty. Those things will happen. One way a machine could potentially do an identification of glamour, Carol, let me know what you think of this. A machine could devise a set of tests for a human. So machine won't be able to just say X is glamorous and Y is not glamorous, but the machine will give set of tests for X and Y, and based on the responses, the machine might be able to assign a higher probability of X being glamorous. I think that might be possible.
So, what would be the data? Can you just re-articulate that, because I think
I don't know what the questions would be. I'm assuming here that there is some predictability. Let me know if this is true. I'm assuming that there is some predictability in the output of a glamorous person in a context. So suppose I create a context, put the glamorous person in there, I have some predictability of behavior of that person. Is there?
Well, you see that I'm inclined right now to disagree with that, because
Yeah.
part of their glamour is a mystery. I mean, glamour is something mysterious. I mean, it evokes mystery. I mean, it's, as I said, I mean, that's the opacity I was talking about. So, and the coercion, I think, is part of that too. The coercive effect it has on the third person, from the third person point of view, is that they don't know. They can't predict, as you can with someone who might lack that quality. I mean, anyone can surprise us at any time, but I think that with a person who's glamorous, there is something unknown by the other, and that's partly why it's so fascinating.
So that is why when I think about, I don't understand it obviously. I think of glamour as a two-way street. It requires an originator, it requires somebody to receive it and have some sort of a feedback. So that's why, but you disagree with that. So you put a glamorous person in a world of no other human being. You believe that person will still be glamorous, in which case no feedback mechanism is needed. But when I think about, I don't obviously understand it. When I think about a glamorous person, I feel like that person is glamorous, true glamour I'm talking about, because there is some interaction.
Well, it can certainly, it's certainly expressed in interaction. I would say that.
Yeah.
But assuming that, you see, I think a person, a human being, can't develop any interior properties without some interaction with others. And
yeah.
But I do think that a glamorous person who finds himself or themselves outside of a social context, certainly their glamour doesn't disappear, because it has to do with the whole take on the world that they have, and their as Danto puts it, what their the fragment of this other world. So that's there's a. So I think that also, if you think about it as something that a person doesn't manufacture, that's the other thing. It's not manufactured.
Right.
So,
right.
I would say, why couldn't the person, in the absence of, certainly true, with false glamour, there has to be a whole social context for that to arise.
Right.
Excuse me. But I would say that to express a self, you can live in a world in which you suddenly find yourself the only human being, the only person, and you can still, you live in that world. It has to do with the way one lives in that world.
Yeah, the challenge would be, since we haven't observed a glamorous person in an empty world, it's a bit like asking when a tree falls in the woods, if there's nobody around,
Right.
does it make a sound?
Right.
We don't know if a glamorous person in a world of nobody else remains glamorous. It's an assumption, right?
Well, it partly follows. I think it follows in part from the way I'm defining it, because it has to do with how that person inhabits this world of no one else. So, does that make sense? Or, yeah.
Yeah. You're defining it as such, and so by definition, that has to be the case. It's an innate property. That property does not require any feedback mechanism, and hence that property will be there regardless of context, regardless of environment. But it follows from definition, right?
Well, yeah, in part, but also from, I suppose, our observations, to me, of the human scene. And because it is a real phenomenon, I think, that this coercion that some persons have. And, it puzzled me. What creates it? Where does it come from? And so.
Yeah, I hate to devalue it, Carol, but one could one could envision a situation that there is a whole magnetic chemical process, since you're using the term coercion, some sort of chemical magnetic process the person is utilizing.
So it's more like bewitchment.
Right?
Is that it? Which is, where the word comes from in a sense. I mean, one of the roots of it, but it. So you're seeing it more as a kind of magic, a kind of spell that.
Yeah, I mean, does it feel like a spell to you, glamour?
Well, I don't know. I think that it might bewitch somebody, but I don't think that it's a conscious effort to bewitch, the way false glamour is. And some people, by the way, pull that off very well, the false glamour.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be conscious, but it could still be a spell sort of thing, right? It is inherent, it is innate, it doesn't require any effort by the individual, but it is a process that surrounds that individual. Could think about it that way.
I think actually that's intriguing. So that even though it's not consciously cultivated, but that makes it, I think, still an internal to the self, unique to a self, to a person's psychic. It's part of a person's psychic economy, I suppose, to do that. But but that would still not. It wouldn't be inconsistent with my idea of it as an imaginative operation, or an operation of the imagination.
Yeah.
So, but I do think you're right that we can't ignore the effect, the third person effect. But I don't think the third person effect is what creates it. Because if we think about, say, a color, like think about the color, a color like robin's egg blue, okay, this light, bright blue.
Yeah.
That there's certain physical properties of the surface when it interacts in certain, conditions of light, then we have that experience of the color. But I think that what's different from, say, an object, or say a wall that's blue, and the person, because that does require a perceiver to see the blueness of it. But I think that what's different with glamour, or with an aesthetic property of a person, is that it really lies in the subjectivity of it. And then these properties might have effects on others, and that may be something more predictable, but it doesn't mean that the person himself or herself is consciously trying to project that, as would be the case with false glamour. And because that person may go into seclusion and still have the same property. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So I think that your questions, I don't think I have a straight answer to them. I thought I came down to no, but I'm going back now, Carol. Because I think, there was this test that, to identify a machine that behaves like a human, you can devise a set of tests and you can say it's a machine or a human. Similarly, I think a machine could devise a set of tests for a human and identify if that human is glamorous or not, I think, ultimately.
Well, it'd be interesting to know what they would be. I mean, perhaps you could articulate that far better than I could. What would count as a test for that? And I guess that would be more of an empirical question. And the philosophical question is whether it makes sense, even conceptually, to think of that as something that can be tested scientifically. Because not everything about a human being can be. I think there's always something that eludes the physical, that escapes it.
Yeah, I'm clearly biased about this. I'm less and less enamored by humans. I don't see anything really special about them. And so I think it is sort of a transition period. We had humans running around.
Yeah, so
But no, but your thoughts here are really really asking the question. In some sense, I can reframe your question as more fundamentally: is there anything special about humans more broadly?
Well, yeah, I would say, I mean, I think there is, and that's because, I mean, you may not agree with this, but I think a human, unlike something that's an alien intelligence or artificial intelligence, I think that a human has consciousness. I think that each human being has a uniqueness that can't be reproduced, some more interesting than others, and that uniqueness comes from their subjectivity, their subjective psychic structure and way of looking at the world. And it's hard to imagine something non-human having consciousness in the way that we do, something that isn't biologically generated. Although I don't know. I mean, I did have a debate with a scientist about this once, because he was talking about how there was some group of researchers who were trying to reproduce a brain that would be like a human brain and would have consciousness, and it just seemed to me so bizarre, given what consciousness is, whatever it is. And the fact that we do have these first person experiences, what is that, and there are things that we can take in. I mean, machines, aren't they highly dependent upon human programming and so forth?
Not necessarily. We already create machines that are able to learn by themselves, and so the fundamental issue there is things can be learned just like humans do from data, right? And machines can do that as well. Now, the question about consciousness, we are, in some sense, we are handicapped. We are suffering from human-centric views, right? We think our brain is, very complex. We have consciousness. Many people believe only humans have consciousness. I completely disagree with that. We can see animals very
Oh, I agree
easily
with
having
that too. I
consciousness.
agree with definitely.
And so if you agree with that, then Carol, you can bring that the complexity of the animal that is housing consciousness less and less. You can go down that animal spectrum. And unless you believe at some point consciousness stops, and it will be an arbitrary, sort of a stoppage point, right? So I go from, complex biological systems to less complex, and so on. And if we believe I'm seeing consciousness in those systems, yeah, at some point you'll get a very simple system, like a zebrafish, for example, and you find consciousness there too. There's only 100,000 neurons, and many of the decisions are made by a few thousand neurons. We already have many orders of magnitude higher complexity in machines. And so if zebrafish, for example, has consciousness, then we are definitely very close to machines having consciousness as well.
Can a machine, though, I mean, see, I think there's a kind of, well, I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert here, but we'd have to change our whole theory of emotion if we were to say that machines could have the kind of complex consciousness and just experience of the world. I mean, it almost sounds well, it seems to me counterintuitive, but so that, we might see them performing intellectual tasks and calculations and so forth, but isn't there some kind of residue that in the human experience that the machine can't have? Or
if you can reduce experience to data, then we will get to a point that we can feed that data to a machine. And so, people talk about, I think, I don't know the movie Her that you mentioned. People talk about you can download your brain where all the data reside. So if you download it and re-upload it, you can, basically upload your personality to a machine, for instance.
well, yeah, I guess but that hasn't been done.
No, we're nowhere
Yeah,
close to
so
that.
you see, I don't know. I mean, a machine is obviously not a biological entity. And I don't know even what it means to talk about a machine having emotions, or would a machine have an unconscious, for example, or a subconscious? Would a machine have traits and dispositions? Would it have individuality, the kind of singularity that we see on the human scene? Not to say that humans are, as you say, so spectacular or that there's anything special about them. Okay, I'll leave that aside. But, we certainly see a wide range of intelligence and emotional sensitivity and et cetera in human beings. But, there's a certain complexity there in which we have this inseparability. And you may be familiar, say, with Thomas Damasio's book, Descartes' Error. I don't know.
I'm not.
Well, he tries to show that, and I'm really, this is just came to my mind, and it's based on my memory, but that we can't separate cognition from our affective selves, so that brain. Descartes separates the intellect from the rest of the person, which actually he inherits from Plato and then certain Christian philosophers. But so that if the intellect is going to be the focus, which is what I think, well, which I may be wrong, but I understand you as saying that, according to him, the intellectual work that we do, our intellectual lives, are inseparable from our affective lives. And
yeah,
that, so it's hard to imagine for me the machine having a personality and having that, yeah. So
yeah. The issue we always run into is that we have very strong human-centric views, right? So that sort of prevents us from thinking this way. We are nowhere close to any of these, but there is no technical reason why we can replicate a human being in the future. It won't be not even in the next 100 years. I mean, it's very difficult to pin down the time, but there's no technical reason one cannot replicate a human being with all the personality, all the data, because everything is fundamentally driven by data. That's assumption there. But your characteristic, a glamour, makes that problem much more complicated. Intellectual capabilities, emotions, personality, all of that is really replicatable. But it seems to me that glamour is going to be much more, it's an order of magnitude higher concept, primarily because it is, as you say, it's really difficult to define true glamour, right? We know it exists, but we don't really have a very clear definition for it. So there might be a set of characteristics that human has. I don't know what they are. Glamour is certainly one of them that cannot be very highly defined. And that might be the last set of characteristics that that may let a human live among.
It may give us our humanness, or yes, our distinctiveness. It may save us. Yes. I also wonder if, not just emotions, but, and this is something that I think we discussed very briefly, is whether a machine could have aesthetic appreciation. It can, maybe it can create art, but can it appreciate art? And that's something perhaps you would have something to say about. But
yeah, I think this is where I think about this, Carol, in this way. So a machine will have average characteristics. It will have a bias toward the average. So in a world of machines, we will see machines doing similar things. They will have a bias toward average. So when you say, will it be able to appreciate things? It will be able to appreciate if it is average. I'm just making this up. If you have things on the edges, on both sides of the distribution of uncertainty, it will likely fail because it seems like a waste of time from the machine's perspective. Yeah. So, a piece of art, there is nothing comparable to it. It is all the way to the right extreme in terms of, some utility for humans. The machine might consider that to be reasonably useless.
I think a lot of people do too, unfortunately. I do think that's unfortunate. But so the machine would not appreciate it because the machine in a sense, has been programmed to value utility and time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and a machine could not appreciate nature. See, I don't even know what it means to predicate appreciation of a machine, and I look to you to explain that to me.
It might also be that, again, we are coming up with these terms because we have a human-centric architecture, right? So we have these terms as if nobody else other than humans would understand them. But it might be figments of our own imagination. So what do we mean by appreciation could be reduced to, set of emotions. Emotions can be reduced to a set of neurons firing, and there are a set of conditions under which those neurons fire. So you can reduce that to some physical process, the term appreciation. Now, humans won't like that, because humans would say, well, appreciation is a very complex thing. You can't really reduce it.
Yeah, it's, I've thought about that a lot and studied this whole problem. I think that, of course, in my training as a philosopher and then later, no, I think that certain aspects of consciousness are irreducible. That there's always some kind of residue that is left out. And I think that that's so really, to say that a machine could appreciate something aesthetically, I think animals can have appreciation of, I've seen,
Sure, absolutely.
yes,
Music, for
music.
example.
They can appreciate, I studied music for many years, and I had a dog who would always sit with me when I practiced, come right in. I could always get her to come over, no matter what, if I were practicing. So, but also I think they appreciate just, actually, what Schopenhauer said that I think is spot on is that he said that dogs appreciate the present moment. He praised them for their ability that he thought human beings didn't have. Today I guess we'd call it mindfulness in the current parlance.
That's right.
But he said that dogs had this ability to just live in the present moment and appreciate it. And to some extent that's true. I also think that they can be future looking. They want things that they don't have, and so forth. So that would be, so yeah, I think I just don't know what it would mean. So you have to assume then that all human processes that we call consciousness can be reduced to a set of data, and once you do that, it's no problem. It's a hop, skip, and a jump for the machine to have these experiences too. And I guess then the fundamental question is, can this all be reduced to data? And
yes,
I think that my analysis of glamour rests on the presumption that you can't.
Right. That is the fundamental question. Can everything be reduced to data? And related question is there anything really special about the human system? It's very difficult to prove. So we don't have an answer to the first question. Can everything be reduced to data? The trends are things are being reduced to data. So how far can we go is an open question. Is there, the second part of it is there something special about the human system, such as consciousness, that is not really driven by data, that is sort of external to the system, and so we don't actually see it, and hence we will never be able to see it. And again, the jury's out on that as well. But the trends are in the direction of the human being reduced, Carol, unfortunately. So you have to defend glamour as a uniquely human property. This might be the only thing we may have to defend in 100 years.
That's maybe so. I mean, but I do think, though, that it's hard to imagine how you reduce imagination to a set of data. I mean, when it's so, it seems to escape rule-governed behavior. Does that make sense? I mean, to you, do you see,
Yeah.
I mean, does my question make sense to you? I'm just asking.
The question makes sense. I'm obviously very highly biased and unbiased about this. I'll always go back and say these ideas that we have, imagination could be thought of, sort of experimentation. It could be thought of random noise introduced into a thought process. So I always land in a spot. I'm not saying this is right. I always land on a spot that says, yeah, anything is ultimately reduced to data. In which case, you can make a machine do it.
Well, maybe glamour will be the counterexample.
Glamour with a counterexample.
Well,
So when is the book coming out?
Probably next year, because I'm still, tidying up the manuscript. But I'll alert you to it, certainly.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Carol. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
And actually, I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount in thinking through this with you. I mean, you've asked me some very difficult questions, and so I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.